Welcome to day 3. All right, so collection sources. You've earned it. You've earned walking away from a lot of discussion to a more hands-on, lab-driven day. Lessons learned on this, and I've got more to share that's outside the slides. I don't want to make this next piece testable, but I find it really, really interesting. So, 6-year-long operations, campaign focus on Chinese strategic targets. I love that they called it Operation SMN. So like their effort together was called Operation SMN. Anybody want to take a guess at what it stood for? Some marketing name. I love it. I've included the report on your USB. It's awful. Like in terms of style and graphics and stuff, it is exactly like a bunch of Intel analysts got together and wrote a report. It's a beautiful report from an analysis perspective. It is something that you'd look at and throw away from a marketing perspective. So it is funny to see this balance need to be there. And I also love that all these different campaigns that were tracked by the different communities ended up being one unified group. But it also goes to the fact that if you were tracking the behaviors and indicators and things of Axiom, really wouldn't have meant much for you for defense. You would have cared more at those campaigns. But to understand the who, it was important to get to a group. But here's a piece that's not in the slides that I love. One of the reasons I love this case study more than most is it was entirely driven by the private sector. No government interaction. None. Zero. Not at all. How crippling was this? Well, I published an Intel report. Who cares? Oh no, it was crippling. What effectively they did is they got all these companies together. Cisco, Fortinet, they got everybody, Microsoft, every security vendor they could bring into the group under trusted discussion. And they said, on this date we go live. And on one date all at once with all the insight that they had, they pushed out new patches that Microsoft mandated, like instant patches. They pushed out new updates. They pushed out new signatures. They pushed out everything all at once. And it was debilitating to the adversary. We are still seeing them try to struggle to get back to where they are today. Microsoft sued them in court behind like closed doors to acquire their command and control servers, like everything all at once. And it may seem like it's easy to recover from that, but it's not. Why is it not? Largely because if it's a 6-year operation or more, the people that were there in the beginning developing the capabilities, the people that were there in the beginning before it all went to UI, the people that understood the science behind the scenes, those people might not even be there anymore. This was actually a big risk for the National Security Agency after all the leaks around their capabilities. The people that built the system are gone. You've built in a strategic weakness to not have people inside of your various governments that understand the science behind the UI, understand the science behind the scenes, which means we can cripple the adversary, which I love. NSA can cry about it later, that's fine, I don't care. We can cripple the adversary, that's exciting. So this was an entirely private company-driven approach, no government involvement whatsoever, focused entirely on crippling a nation-state's intelligence capability in a way that was extremely effective. If that doesn't motivate you, I got nothing for you. Like that's defense that we can do. That's insights through Intel. That's what we do as a team. Any good story, any good case study has got to have an element of love and revenge and hate. This is this story. How many of you remember Bit9 getting compromised? That one now, everybody remembers that one now. So it wasn't, I liked Carbon Black and Bit9 when they merged on. I like Bit9, but not necessarily a fault to Bit9. The marketing language around the application whitelisting market was basically, you never have to do anything again. Just do application whitelisting and we can stop all things ever from everyone. That was some of the sales pitches. It was dirty, it was silly, because application whitelisting is super useful, super effective. But the marketing was just a little bit ahead of its skis. And then in 2012, security vendor Bit9, who actually was a good vendor. I didn't really see a whole lot of dirty marketing out of them, but good vendor, they ended up getting compromised. And everybody ate their lunch over it. It was almost like this ha-ha attitude in the InfoSec community, because we always do that. We never celebrate wins in defense. We just beat each other up. It's really immature. But people jumping online like, aha, see, it's exploitable. There's no silver bullets. But what was the real lesson learned? A nation-state level adversary was going after their targets and had so much trouble doing so that they had to double back to compromise the vendor just to start their operation against the victim. That's called winning, okay? That's awesome. If your security providers are not necessarily your weakness in supply chain, but they're your first line of defense where they have to be compromised first, that's awesome. So Bit9, what happened is this team, this Axiom group, if you will, went and compromised Bit9. They got their malware signed by the private key from Bit9. That way it could be deployed against their targets. Now, it was a little bit embarrassing how it was done, a SQL injection attack. We should probably fix that. But either way, eventually, Bit9 was like, this sucks. You know what? We should all team up. So it wasn't just orchestrated by Bit9. Actually, most of it was led by Microsoft, but I like the revenge story of this and Bit9 getting involved. So that's what happened. Axiom really isn't a activity group. It is a threat actor. It is here's all the insights we have on the who. And so they were trying to say this is the Axiom group of people. They've done tons of different campaigns over the years, but we're going after the who in this case. And they teamed up. Novetta, iSight, Bit9, Cisco, lots of others. I don't put Microsoft in the slides because it's always weird to include Microsoft in things because their PR people always yell at you. But like 90% of this was Microsoft. They did a fantastic job. But anyways, it was a ton of different teams got together, and they attributed it to the Chinese intelligence community. Specifically said, this is Chinese nation state, this is Chinese intelligence community. And how did they do that? Well, effectively, they pooled resources from all the insights into all the intrusion analysis and all the crap you did yesterday on all the kill chain stuff. They had that structured out. A lot of companies, basically what companies got included in the group had less to do with partnerships and marketing and more to do with the analyst-to-analyst relationships at those companies of what people were doing kill chain and diamond model style analysis. Did the multi-vendor team agree on a standard for communication? No. SixNTaxi was sold to the civilian community on the premises of the intelligence agencies are using this. This is how all the intelligence community shares. Liars! Absolute liars. I remember when that stupid committee was formed. And what had happened was the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA weren't sharing data on intrusion analysis. They just weren't doing it. And MITRE came, I like MITRE a lot, actually. MITRE does some really cool research in the community. But a MITRE analyst came along and said, well, it's obvious. They're not sharing because it's in the wrong formats. What? No Intel analyst could not process like JSON versus CSV versus slides. That's not the problem. The problem is every time I, as an NSA analyst, gave somebody to the FBI, they arrested him. Every time I gave somebody to the CIA, they killed him. And every time the CIA passed it to someone like me, I was like, let's just monitor him. We hated each other. It was mission-driven. Different mission focuses. It has nothing to do with data sets. But what happened is they built SixNTaxi inside the government for government agencies to use, and we all refused. Oh, civilian community! This is what the intelligence community uses. So, yeah. Look, I'm going to teach you how to use SixNTaxi because you're going to get slapped with it. I am personally extremely biased against it. But here's my point to your question. Nobody cared. There's never been a problem with communication standards amongst analysts that wanted to work together. Usually the challenge is, how do I find the analysts that I want to work together with at companies? But a lot of us knew each other, had backgrounds working with each other, and pulled together the little tiger team of people that were going to share. And again, most of the who got on and off the island had less to do with standards and frameworks and whatever, and more of, are you doing intrusion analysis? Are you doing a bunch of OSINT suite stuff, or do you have intrusions to bring to this that are insightful? Did you do analysis across some model, kill chain or diamond? Cool, welcome to the party. And a lot of these abstracted thoughts between these companies were just captured in diamond, actually. A lot of it was just the diamond model analysis. So what they did is they said, look, across all of our findings, across all of these different intrusion sets, there's been missing pieces that each other didn't have. And that's because as you work in an investigation, sometimes it comes down to one intrusion to combine everything together, right? That one intrusion to rule them all. It unites everything. I've worked cases before where I worked an activity group, had them tracked for 2 years, lost all visibility, didn't see him anymore, had one intrusion added later on, and united a bunch of other stuff for me that gave me overnight 5 years of data instead of 2. Because I had all the data, but it wasn't connected. But I still needed that one to do it. That's basically what happened here. They shared that intrusion data so they could see the connections. And over their data set, they found that it existed for over 6 years, 6 years of targeting, and largely just lots of different types of malware. Some of the companies were tracking things off of malware, and people pulled it back and said, look, it's not about the malware, but look at the different tools they're using. And then they said, well, is there any victim commonality in all the intrusion data? They found there was. A lot of the victims were NGOs and economic interests and energy organizations and research and development. And that seems like I'm just saying everybody. So what's the commonality? They were all identified in China's 5-year plan as the strategic targets for China. They were able to find these connections. So that's exactly what they did. Lots of the victims can be mapped back to the public plan. And for those of you that are thinking in your heads, and you're probably not, but I'm going to prompt it anyways, thinking in your heads of, why do they advertise where they're going to target? Why does a nation need to publish a document to tell everybody what to go after? The joys of bureaucracy and government. Every state does this. All your major states, I should say. I don't know if the Vatican does it, but all your major states do it. Absolutely had it where we all have to publish these giant documents. U.S. does it. Great Britain does it. Germany does it. Everybody does it. Why? Because when you're the leader of a large nation, communication is hard. When you're a military and intelligence organization, communication is hard. And in the Western world, we tend to have an extremely rigorous hierarchy. President, task, Director of National Intelligence, task, National Security Council. National Security Council thinks they're in the tasking, they're not. They're just advisors. It's like 18-year-old kids from college or some crap. But then it rolls down further, and it comes down, and there's your military commanders and 4-star generals with 3-star generals who have 2-star generals, and oh my gosh, there's layers and layers and layers. But it's structured. Somewhere, someone knows all the operations going on. They may not have perfect visibility. The president surely doesn't know every single operation the U.S. runs, but if he wants to know, he can, and he knows who to ask. But if you're dealing in a less structured hierarchy, especially places like Russia and China, where you might have more oligarchs involved in Russian operations, you might have more cybercrime elements woven back and forth between state operations. In China, you might have a commander who's basically just working at whatever the commander focuses on. There's structure. I don't want to downplay the structure, but there's less structure, or less styled. Might even be more effective, but it's less styled. To where these documents of, hey, here's who is important to us. These are the targets we need to go after. We're really concerned about energy development and nanotechnology for microprocessors for supercomputing. We as the state of China think that AI is going to be super critical to our advancement in economics. Therefore, I'm hypersensitive to anything relating to that type of technology. When you advertise that out, now your units underneath you get tasking and go, okay, well, I need to be mapped to that. And if I want funding, if I want budget, I better have in my mission statement ties to that. That's generally how states tend to work. Now, there's all sorts of other things we can talk about cybercrime, and we'll get there. But for this case study, that was actually a really important thing. And what are we speaking about? Geopolitics, history, policy, not tech, not malware analysis. It's the softer, fuzzier skills here. It takes all types. Anyways, what else do we see? We saw really unique insights, like more complex malware against harder targets. If it was a lower-end target, cheaper, crappier malware. I worked a case, actually, there was an energy company in Canada and an energy company in the U.S., and they were both owned by the same holdings company. A lot of my case studies come from the industrial community, but they apply anywhere. Energy company in the U.S., energy company in Canada. The energy company in Canada, we did the incident response. Amazingly good security. Really, really, really well done. And the adversary pulled out unique custom malware. They did throw a couple zero-day exploits. Some really, really stealthy but good maneuvering on targets. Really well done. They found a VPN connection. We could see it. Found a VPN connection, VPN'd into the energy company in the U.S. They're sister companies, but they're still connected. Sister company wasn't doing hardly anything for security. The basics of security at best. And you could see a couple days difference that the adversary dropped their capabilities. Now it was Metasploit modules. It was faster, quicker operations. It was a different tempo. felt like the same team, but it was completely different in its activity clustering. It was an easier target. So we know this type of thing happens, and we see it happen all the time, which is also interesting that if you're trying to just persist off of sharing indicators and things like that, it depends not even what adversary it is, but what profile you are for that adversary. That's another reason that indicators can be extremely useful, but not necessarily the best threat detection. All right. Also, all sorts of unique naming conventions. So this gets into the domain stuff we're going to do, where it's like, hey, C2 naming convention. Tracking it is hard. So how are we going to track? Well, we're going to put the company's name in our domain. So it'd be like sans.badguy.com. So they started putting subdomains tied to, or domains tied to, the places they were targeting. Well, that's a pretty good behavior to pick up on. That's not an indicator. That's a pretty good behavior of, is my company name showing up in other people's domains coming out of my network? That would be good to find. Very clearly different team and hands-off, and this is what was being discussed earlier. There was very clearly the team that was getting access and doing the HitKit malware-styled intrusions, and then different teams actually do the operations internally. The important thing to understand about PlugX is that it was the successor to Poison Ivy. So way back when, Poison Ivy was essentially the go-to tool for Chinese-based teams. Go-to tool. Then it leaked out and became available and was easy to reverse, and everybody adopted it. And so at one point, it was unique to Chinese-based groups, but at some undefined point that defenders couldn't clearly differentiate on, it became more common. So attributing based off of malware was extremely inappropriate and immature analysis. But with Poison Ivy and PlugX, there was something really, really interesting about how they developed it. And that was that it was entirely UI-driven. It is a very, very simple tool. I mean, simple to the point of we could spend 5 minutes or less spinning all of you up, no matter how much of operations experience you've had or not, and you would be able to use PlugX to input the inputs of what, here's the IP address I want to target, here's the exploit I want to use, here's the things. It was, think about it, Metasploit-like capability, but with a UI and way more basic. Why is that interesting? And why is it interesting that Poison Ivy was probably more complicated than PlugX was? PlugX was even simpler. Why is that interesting? Absolutely lowers the barrier to entry. Why might an adversary want to be lowering the barrier to entry? Tons of junior people that they need to get working and up and running. It's almost, and who knows, let's live in the land of hypothetical, for example, but it's almost like a global adversary started doing some operations, didn't really expect it to be super successful back in the early days, became really successful, and then spent up way too many military units all at one time, went, oh shit, what do we do? Here's a UI, click this button, hack this guy. That kind of happens everywhere. It's easy to imagine with China, but it's everywhere. Like, even on the US side of, hey, cyber commands, let's spin up let's spin up weapon systems and hackers and do cyber fanciness. And we've been doing it for a while. We've got really cool teams. But now we've never had one weapon system. Let's go ahead and launch 9 at once. You're like, what? You're like, 9 capabilities for 9 missions with a bunch of teams. And let's have 300 cyber protection teams that spin up out of nowhere. You're like, oh my gosh, like there's so many people that I've got to get trained. And quality is going to go down. And you got to have a very rigorous quality. You got to have a very rigorous evaluation, very rigorous standardization. This is not a U.S. challenge. This is not a German challenge. This is not a French challenge. This is just how big companies operate. Big companies have to deal with tasking and requirements and knowledge management and training and evaluation and onboarding. And simple little basic tools give us insight into the evolution of those teams. It's not a one-for-one. We can't be like, therefore it has a UI, therefore their operators are basic. I wish. Can't do that. But it can give us an insight, small little insight. So we might look for things. How might we use that insight? We might look for things that are OPSEC related. We might understand that maybe they're spinning up so quickly that there's things that we can queue up on like infrastructure overlap that we may not expect from more experienced teams. So that's exactly what they started looking at. One of my all-time favorite case studies is the Axiom Group. I love this. This is my favorite part about this whole thing, is this teaming, this effort impacted many of your organizations. And no one's ever heard of it. It's like 3 or 4 people. Why? Because they didn't market it at all. Probably took the opposite end of the spectrum. Because what always happens, hey, I found some new vulnerability. Here's a website and a logo. Or here's some new group. I named it Fancy, Tortilla or whatever, and we're going to go and speak at RSA and talk about how awesome we are. We didn't do any defense, but God, we're awesome. That stuff's annoying. But there is a balance. If you don't do any marketing, then nobody even knows it happened, and it might be super important to them. So there's a balance for organizations to hit. They probably overcorrected a little bit, but I appreciated it. So HitKit's another pretty basic piece of malware, but it's super, super interesting in the choice the adversary made on how it operates. For HitKit to work, you place it on a system. You target a system, or otherwise have a system that becomes a victim. And instead of beaconing out, it just opens a port. So it does not beacon out to command and control address at all. It just opens up a port. And then the adversary connects into it. What does that mean? Right off the bat, what does that mean for us? Less detectable. So it's going to be more stealthy, which might have an indication that the adversary is looking for more long-term operations, potentially. No givens, but things to consider. But what does it introduce as a huge challenge for the adversary? Yeah, connect to it. You got to know where it is. You got to keep up with it. I can't spray and pray, right? I can't take the approach of I'm going to mass email or compromise a website or hit up everybody in the world and hope for the best. They'll beacon back to me and let me know where they are. No, you got to know where you're targeting. You got to keep up with the victims to know exactly who to connect into and where. It's a different challenge. It's a different infrastructure choice. It speaks to me at a first point. Remember, I'm going to caveat everything I ever say because there are no definitives in Intel. But my first assumption here, my first I wonder, is this seems more targeted in nature. It seems more long-term. It seems more stealthy. This seems more espionage-like. This is very interesting from the targeting aspect.